Jason Duggar. Once the golden boy of the Duggar clan, admired by millions who followed the family's journey on reality TV. But behind the cameras, behind the carefully curated image of faith and family values, Jason's life spiraled into chaos. Drugs, online gambling, death, betrayal, and ultimately prison. Today we're diving deep into the shocking downfall of Jason Duggar, a story that shook even the most loyal Duggar fans. Jason Duggar was born into the center of the Duggars, the most well-known reality TV family in America. Jason was portrayed as the golden boy from the start of filming. Well-mannered, well-behaved, and presumably destined to uphold the family's principles for future generations. Jason's upbringing was influenced by rigorous rules, unshakable faith, and the continual reminder that the world was watching him while he was being watched over by Michelle and Jim Bob Duggar. Millions of people watched every motion, every word, and every smile because they thought the Duggar household was a stronghold of morality and harmony. Jason was a fantastic fit for the part. He was ambitious, obedient, and appealing. His parents proudly held him up as an example of everything their family stood for, and he was adored by fans and siblings. From the outside, Jason appeared to be a young guy who was fortunate to have love, opportunity, and a clear route to success. However, fissures were beginning to appear behind the glossy appearance. Jason felt a great deal of pressure to be flawless. Being raised under the spotlight meant that every flaw was concealed and every error was emphasized. Even though the cameras showed a happy son, the truth was far more nuanced. Jason Duggar was more than just the ideal son. He was a young guy on the precipice of a storm that nobody could predict, not even his family. For millions of viewers, Jason Duggar's upbringing appeared picture perfect. The family meals, the laughing, and the innocent portrayal of a youngster growing up in a home based on discipline and faith were all caught on camera. However, the invisible weight bearing down on Jason's shoulders was never visible to the spectators. Being raised in the Duggar household meant being watched all the time. The lens of reality television magnified every word, every action, and every decision. Perfection was demanded by the family's reputation and by fans. Jason was more than just a son. He was a live representation of the Duggar brand. The strain was constant behind the scenes. Jason had to act when he was worn out, smile when he didn't want to, and live up to ideals that occasionally seemed unachievable. The world continued to watch, and the cameras continued to roll. The spotlight turned into a cage for a young man who was striving to define himself. The more Jason attempted to live up to the stereotype of the perfect son, the more fissures started to show. He was caught between his own self and the person the world expected him to be. And the seeds of revolt were sown in that conflict between anticipation and reality. It wasn't drugs or gambling that led to Jason Duggar's downfall. Here, in the silent suffocation of the unseen pressure of fame, it all started. Jason Duggar's downfall started very subtly, almost imperceptibly, rather than with a spectacular explosion. Jason began pushing limits away from the cameras and the family's prying eyes. It started out with tiny decisions, like spending late nights on the internet, being curious about things his parents had cautioned against, and enjoying the rush of breaking the strict Duggar rules. Online gambling was the source of the initial temptations. Jason persuaded himself that gambling was nothing serious, just fun, and a way to get away from the oppressive demands of being the perfect son. Gambling appeared harmless. Only a few clicks, a few bucks wagered, and an adrenaline rush as the screen flashed win. However, temptation tends to rise. The little wagers grew bigger. The excitement of victory gave way to the desperation of trying to recover losses. Jason became more and more ensnared in a world that promised freedom, but delivered chains with each login. Then the medications arrived. What began as experimentation, a means of relieving stress and stifling the need for perfection, quickly turned into dependence. The tiredness in Jason's eyes was concealed by his smile on camera. The rising instability inside was concealed by his charm. Unaware of the impending tempest, The Duggar family persisted in portraying Jason as their model, but the golden lad was slipping behind closed doors. The initial temptations had taken hold and were on the verge of developing into something much more harmful. When narcotics entered Jason Duggar's life, his decline into darkness took a more drastic turn. What started out as experimentation, a means of escaping the oppressive demands of being the perfect son, quickly turned into reliance. It seemed subtle at first. A hit here, a pill there, moments snatched from the family's prying eyes and the cameras. However, the alterations were quickly irrefutable. Jason lost his once bright vitality. The very thing that made him a fan favorite, his charm, started to wane. He became agitated, aloof, and restless. No amount of prayer or family support could quell the appetites that overwhelmed the youngster, who had once represented discipline and faith. Jason found solace in drugs that fame could never provide. Release from the constant need to be perfect, relief from the image, and relief from the pressure. However, such relief came at a terrible price. His relationships became strained, his judgment became impaired, and his health started to decline. Despite putting up a united front for the outside world, the Duggar family had difficulties behind closed doors. As Michelle saw her kid drift farther away, her heart ached. Jim Bob attempted to approach Jason since he was adamant about his beliefs, but the addiction had already taken hold. Jason Duggar was fighting more than just temptation. He was fighting a monster that threatened to devour everything, including his family, his future, and the legacy he was supposed to defend. Online gaming served as the most devastating outlet for Jason Duggar's covert rebellion. What started off as innocuous curiosity soon developed into a compulsive fixation. Jason was unable to escape the world of flashing screens, the promise of immediate income, and the rush of taking risks. The wagers were modest at first. A few bucks here, a few bucks there. However, the rush of victory was addictive, and the pain of defeat only encouraged him to place larger bets. Every defeat made him want another opportunity, and every victory made him believe he was unbeatable. Jason found himself in a vicious circle from which he was unable to break free. Jason sat by himself night after night, seeking the flush of triumph. His family assumed he was working, learning, or relaxing. In fact, he was delving farther into an online gambling parlor that never shut down. Quietly, away from the Duggar household and the cameras, the debts accumulated. Addiction, however, is not always concealed. Jason's attitude changed. He became agitated, restless, and seized by the desire to gamble once more. The once disciplined and devout golden child was now imprisoned by a habit that depleted both his finances and his soul. Unity and morals had been the cornerstones of the Duggar family's reputation, but Jason's secret was undermining that. His addiction to gambling was more than simply a personal battle. It was the start of a family-wide calamity. Children have always been the center of Michelle Duggar's family. She was the mother who felt that faith and love could mend any hurt, the steadfast presence, and the guiding hand. However, she had never encountered anything like Jason's spiral. Michelle initially attempted to explain his actions by pointing to his mood swings, his secrecy, and their increasing separation. She whispered softly, prayed more, and hoped her son would return. However, the reality became unavoidable. Jason was engulfed, not simply suffering. He had become addicted to drugs and gambling, and the boy she had once referred to as her golden child was drifting farther and farther away every day. When Jason's demands became combative, it was the tipping point. He was now demanding money to feed his addictions rather than asking for assistance. Michelle was horrified to see her son confront Jim Bob and demand $16,000. Jason became enraged when his father refused, upsetting the precarious harmony in the home. In that instant, Michelle's entire life fell apart. With his eyes full of hatred and desperation, the kid she had raised with love and discipline suddenly stood as a stranger. The knowledge that her family's cohesiveness was disintegrating left her feeling helpless, heartbroken, and mentally damaged. This was more than just money or addiction for Michelle. It was about seeing her child ruin himself and realizing that the storm had already started and that no prayer, no law, and no Duggar custom could stop it. When Jason's addiction clashed with his family's morals, the tension within the Duggar household reached a breaking point. Jason, no longer satisfied with concealing his hardships, went to his father, Jim Bob, and made an astonishing demand: $16,000 in cash. It wasn't an appeal for assistance. It wasn't an appeal for help. Sharp, assertive, and driven by desperation, it was a demand. Jason thought that having money would keep his drug usage going, feed his gambling habit, and silence his creditors. However, Jim Bob declined since he was adamant about his beliefs. He refused to give the money to anyone, not even his son. Jason became enraged at the rejection. Once the epitome of deference and obedience, the golden child now stood squarely facing his father, his voice high, his rage roiling. The Duggar home was rocked by the altercation. Michelle found it intolerable to witness her kid snap at the guy who had led their family for many years. When she saw how Jason's addiction had changed him into someone she no longer knew, her heart broke. The $16,000 demand was a pivotal moment. Money was no longer the only factor. It had to do with control, power, and the destructive hold of addiction. Once united, the Duggar family was now in danger of internal disintegration due to a storm. Once hailed as a stronghold of harmony and faith, the Duggar household was now disintegrating from the inside out. The family's hearts had been broken by Jason's addictions, leaving a path of stress, anxiety, and heartache in their wake. Unable to comprehend how the brother they had once admired had changed, siblings talked in low voices. The fact that the golden boy was no longer the same shook everyone, yet some felt sympathy and others hate. Raised to believe that strength comes from unity, the Duggar children now looked on helplessly as their home's foundation began to crack. Michelle was mentally damaged and burdened with grief and shame. She kept asking herself whether she had failed as a mother, if she had missed the warning signs, and if she could have prevented her son's downward spiral. Determined but exhausted, Jim Bob battled to strike a balance between compassion and discipline because he knew that every choice he made had the potential to either save Jason or drive him farther away. The formerly peaceful home turned into an emotional battleground. Once associated with family values, the Duggar name now held hints of scandal as faith was put to the test and trust was betrayed. Prayers became disputes, and hope became despair behind closed doors. There was a crisis for the Duggar family. The question of whether the family could weather the storm or if Jason's decline would drag them all into the darkness with him became more pressing as his addictions worsened. Once concealed, Jason Duggar's gambling addiction suddenly became a terrible reality. What started out as modest bets had grown into disastrous losses. It was startling to learn that Jason had accrued $90,000 in debt. Like vultures, creditors circled, demanding money. Once acclaimed for his charm and discipline, the golden boy of the Duggar clan was now drowning in duties from which he was unable to break free. He was just driven farther into the abyss by each click, wager, and last-ditch effort to regain what he had lost. Already shattered by Jason's drug usage and demands, the family now had to deal with the crushing weight of publicity. The realization that her kid was not just struggling, but was ensnared in a financial nightmare that threatened to ruin him devastated Michelle's heart. Shaken but determined, Jim Bob declined to help Jason since he knew that doing so would just encourage his addiction. There was conflict in the Duggar household behind closed doors. The family's reputation was on the verge of collapse. Fans conjectured about Jason's disappearance, and siblings talked about the debt. The $90,000 debt was more than just a figure. It was evidence that Jason's downward spiral had reached its limit. The turmoil that had been building inside the Duggar family was about to burst into the public view as the creditors got ready to take action. When creditors launched a lawsuit against Jason Duggar after becoming weary of waiting for cash, his personal turmoil eventually came to light. The enormous $90,000 debt was no longer a secret embarrassment. Rather, it was documented in court and brought the Duggar name into the public eye for all the wrong reasons. The charges were harsh. Jason was accused of mistreating his parents, abusing their confidence, and undermining the very principles upon which the Duggar family had established their image, in addition to not paying his obligations. The controversy was heartbreaking for a household that had long advocated discipline and harmony. The Duggar family sat silently in the courtroom while Jason's other life was exposed. The evidence, which included testimonials that depicted a young man engulfed in addiction, gambling transactions, and unpaid loans, caused the golden kid image to disintegrate. As the truth came to light, Jason's former admirers watched in shock. The trial was an ordeal for Michelle. It felt like a dagger every time someone spoke against her son. Stoic but frightened, Jim Bob found it difficult to make peace with the man he had reared and the one who was now being judged. Once invincible in the eyes of their followers, the Duggar family was now forced to face the fact that their son's demise was inevitable. Money wasn't the only issue in the lawsuit. It was about responsibility, treachery, and the disintegration of an image that had been meticulously constructed over many years. One thing became evident as the verdict approached. Jason Duggar's life will never be the same. Jason Duggar's secret life was ultimately revealed in the courts. The picture of the golden lad had vanished, to be replaced by a young man on trial for addiction, debt, and treachery. Once associated with family values and faith, the Duggar name now reverberated through the legal system under a shroud of scandal. The proceedings were tense. Attorneys presented the evidence, which included witnesses, gambling transactions, and unpaid loans that portrayed Jason as irresponsible and enslaved. The carefully constructed image the family had created over years of reality TV was undermined by every little detail. Michelle sat in silence, anguish written on her face. Every charge was like a blade, and every admission brought back memories of her son who had died of addiction. As he heard about Jason's violence and financial devastation, Jim Bob, who was stoic but clearly rattled, found it difficult to remain composed. The strain of public scrutiny now seems to have shattered the once unified family. Spectators who had been Duggar supporters for years looked on in shock. Jason was not the only subject of the courtroom drama. It also dealt with the breakdown of an ideal and the disintegration of a family that had been praised as an example of religion and discipline. The stress became intolerable as the trial progressed. The final decision on Jason Duggar's downfall was drawing near. A young man who had previously been poised for greatness was publicly confronted in the courtroom drama, which went beyond a simple legal dispute. As the judge got ready to make the final ruling, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Formerly the golden kid of America's most well-known reality TV family, Jason Duggar was now embroiled in a controversy that had destroyed his reputation and left only the brutal realities of addiction and treachery. The $90,000 debt, his parents' abuse, his careless gambling, and the drug usage that had dominated his life were all indisputable proof. The judge's comments pierced the room as the Duggar family sat in silence, their faces twisted with agony. Jason was sentenced to 3 months in jail, forced rehabilitation, and a $150,000 fine. The sentencing was a reckoning rather than merely a punishment. For Jason, it meant dealing with the fallout from decisions that had gotten out of hand. The Duggar family had to face the fact that the world now knew that their golden kid had fallen. The idea of her son in prison broke Michelle's heart, and she sobbed silently. Jim Bob maintained his composure, but the sadness and disappointment were evident in his eyes. Once considered untouchable by their fans, the family now bore the scars of scandal. Jason's trial came to an end with the verdict, but it was just the start of his path through punishment, atonement, and the arduous process of reconstructing a life that had fallen apart due to addiction. Jason Duggar's life of intrigue and secrecy ultimately clashed with the harsh reality of prison after the verdict was handed down. The Duggar home's protective walls, the meticulously manicured appearance, and the cameras were all gone. Jason's freedom, his family's protection, and his sense of control were all taken away from him for the first time. Jason had to deal with a society inside the prison walls that didn't give a damn about his notoriety or family name. The reality TV Golden Kid was suddenly just another prisoner with the same routines, the same restrictions, and the same harsh surroundings. His cell's terrible silence served as a continual reminder of the decisions that had brought him to this point. The monotony of the days blended together. Cold meals, strict timetables, and the burden of remorse took the place of the glamour of his old existence. Jason's defiance gave way to despair, and his rage gave way to introspection. He had to face the fact that his addictions had stolen both his freedom and his reputation. Michelle could not face the idea of her son incarcerated. She prayed for a miracle that may bring him back, for his safety, and for his atonement. Despite his determination, Jim Bob was burdened by the knowledge that his son's demise had become a public spectacle. Once untouchable, the Duggar family now carried irreversible scandal scars. For Jason Duggar, prison served as both a mirror and a form of retribution. A mirror reflecting the devastation created by his decisions, the suffering he had inflicted, and the arduous path he would need to take if he ever wanted to start over. Jason Duggar entered the next stage of his sentence, rehabilitation, after serving 3 months in prison. He had lost his freedom in prison, but he had lost his denial in treatment. Jason had to face his addiction, the monster that had taken over his life, for the first time. The place was bleak, silent, and harsh. Counseling sessions, group therapy, and the unrelenting task of reconstructing a broken identity occupied the days. Once the Duggar clan's golden boy, Jason was now seated among strangers who had similar battle scars from gambling and drugs. Raw honesty and the agonizing healing process were all that existed. There were no photographs or family image to preserve. Jason initially objected. He bore the burden of humiliation from slipping so far from grace, the weight of shame, and the fury of being revealed. The walls, however, started to crumble gradually. He acknowledged the reality in therapy. He had escaped because of the need to be flawless, and those escapes had devastated him. Michelle held on to hope, hoping that her son would return from rehab. Despite his caution, Jim Bob understood that this was Jason's sole opportunity for atonement. The family waited tensely for indications that Jason could emerge from the ruins, disfigured but still united by love. Rehabilitation was a long-term solution. It was difficult, unsettling, and hurtful. However, it was the first step for Jason Duggar to take back a life that had been lost to addiction. It was still unclear if he would succeed or relapse, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Through his path, Jason Duggar has gone from being admired to being scandalized. Even though prison and rehabilitation had made him face the consequences of his decisions, the question that still plagued him was bigger than his debt and sentence. What would be his legacy? Jason had been the golden boy for years, representing discipline, faith, and family harmony.